Our speaker comes to us from Concord, North Carolina. I tried my best to persuade him to spend the night, but he goes all over the country, does all kinds of things, and very busy schedule, and is going to have to drive back tonight. So, but he did us the extreme courtesy of driving down on Interstate 85. I think riding in a Huey helicopter was more comfortable than riding down Interstate 85 at night in the misting rain. So we really do appreciate it. But Joe Galloway, you all know his bio. Joe Galloway is quite simply the finest war correspondent to come out of the Vietnam War, period, end of story. Joe covered the war. He's not the best known because the best known stayed in Saigon and got on the television all the time. Saigon was the last place that Joe wanted to be because that's not where the action was. He'd find out where it was and try to hitch a ride on a helicopter, go and make resupply. Or he'd go out with the unit on the initial patrol. And that's how he got to the Ia Drang Valley, and he will tell us that story. And from that book, he and then Lieutenant, who was a Lieutenant Colonel, Hal Moore, later on Lieutenant General Hal Moore, he and Hal Moore co-authored the finest book about a battle in the Vietnam War to come out that there has ever been written, and that's this book, We Were Soldiers Once and Young. It was made into a movie. It was a bestseller. It sold 1.3 million copies. Like I say, was a movie made by Mel Gibson. That was a hit movie. It was really one of the first books that told America what that war was like. And in my own personal opinion, no one can understand combat unless they've been in combat. If you don't go into combat and you want to do the next best thing, I'd say read this book. This is an incredible book. I've read it twice. And there are copies up there that Fiction Addiction has brought to us. So buy one afterwards, and Joe will sign it for you. I also was fascinated by the second book, We Are Soldiers Still. It's about a trip that he and General Moore went back to Vietnam and visited the battlefield with the people who were commanding the Vietnamese troops they were fighting against. This is a fine, fine book, and I tell you what, I've told some young people that in business looking for books on leadership, there's a chapter here on leadership. It's the finest thing I've seen on leadership written anywhere. There are books about leadership that are not as good as what's in here, and it's all, Joe, it's all in one chapter. This is a fine, fine book, and you want to have both of them, and there's copies up there. So you didn't come here to hear me talk. I apologize, but Joe, I just had a lot of announcements I had to make. I want to say you honor us by your presence. Joe, he won't tell you this either. I'll have to tell you this. He was the only war correspondent during the entire Vietnam War to be awarded the Bronze Star for Valor for what happened in the Ia Drang Valley. So, Joe, you honor us by your presence.
Thanks, Bob, for that nice introduction. Thank you all for turning out on a kind of misty, dark night. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you. I have the great honor and privilege to work as a consultant with the Vietnam War 50th Anniversary Commemoration Project. And I get to go all over the country doing film interviews, oral history interviews with Vietnam veterans, and it's far more fun than work. And I learn something new from every story. And these will go uncut, untouched, unedited into the oral history archives of the Library of Congress, and we also hope to tighten them up and put them on DVD and ship them to every high school in America. And so if a kid 50 years from now wants to write a paper on Vietnam, he can do original, from the source research. Now, that's the good part. The bad part is having that job means I get to go to Washington, D.C. more often than I would care to. And the last trip, I ran across a couple of stories that might not have penetrated down here, so I'm going to tell you about them. One evening just after dark, a tall, silver-haired, distinguished-looking fellow wearing about a $6,000 Italian suit was walking near Capitol Hill when a fellow jumped out of the alley, stuck a pistol in his ribs, and said, "Give me your money." Guy got all indignant. He drew himself up and said, "You can't do this to me. I'm a congressman." Guy with the pistol looks at him and says, "Okay, in that case, give me my money." Now, the other story was about a 9-0 unanimous Supreme Court decision, and I can tell you those are rare as chicken's teeth. And it was 9-0 decision that Washington, D.C. could not have a nativity scene this Christmas. Wasn't a matter of separation of church and state. It was that they could not find 3 wise men or a virgin in that town. But they did find enough asses to fill every stable in the country. You never go broke telling D.C. jokes. But it is a delight to be here with you, and I look back 50 years. It's 50 years ago last April I landed in Vietnam, 23 years old. I'd been working for 6 years as a journalist. Ever since I was 17. Got my education on a city desk of a daily newspaper in Texas. And from 1963 on, I was fighting to get to Vietnam. I would read on the wire the stories filed out of a place called Saigon by David Halberstam of the New York Times, Neil Sheehan of United Press International. I worked for UPI. And I knew there was going to be a war there. It was going to become an American war. It would be my generation's war. And by God, I knew that 50 years later it would be a lot easier to explain why I went than if I didn't. And so I drove my bosses crazy for 2 years. And finally, it came down to either they were going to send me to Asia or they were going to fire me, and thank God they sent me to Tokyo. I landed there in December of 1964 and immediately asked to go to Saigon, and the boss laughed at me. But I just held my tongue, and in March of the following year, 65, the 1st Battalion of the 9th Marines landed at Da Nang, and a week or 2 later, I was on my way to Vietnam. I stopped in Saigon for 2 days, got my press passes, and went straight to Da Nang and began covering all of the Marine operations in I Corps. And I must say that in 7 months of doing that, the Marines taught me just enough to keep the Army from getting me killed. Someone will always say, "Well, what'd they teach you, Joe?" And I say, "Well, they taught me how to sleep standing up and how to run laying down. And they taught me there's a right way and a wrong way and a Marine way, and the Marine way is the only way." Did I get that right, guys? But I went there not knowing a lot about war other than what I'd seen in John Wayne movies and what I had read of Ernie Pyle's columns from World War II and things like that. I didn't know a lot. And combat is a horrific learning curve. 60% of the casualties on our side occurred during the first 3 months of a tour for those individuals. That's how steep the learning curve is. And on my first operation, I saw my first dead Americans. In fact, I helped find them on a battlefield where everyone was dead. And I helped carry them to the helicopter. And I didn't see John Wayne in their faces. I really began at that moment to doubt that we were prepared to do all that it would take to win that war. I thought, given the numbers that I had seen, it would take 1 million American soldiers, boots on the ground, horrific casualty list, and probably 10 or 15 years' time. And I didn't believe then that the American people were willing to put up with that for as long as it would take and all that it would cost, not only in national treasure, but the real national treasure, the lives of our sons. But that said, my job as a UPI correspondent was to cover the stories, to cover the soldiers, the Marines, to tell their stories. It wasn't to give my opinion. UPI didn't believe that. They said I could have an opinion. I just couldn't put any of it in any of my stories. Fair enough, fair enough. The other thing was, as time went on, the soldiers became, the Marines, the soldiers became my brothers. And there's no way in hell that I could stand there and tell them that their friends were dying for nothing. They didn't believe that. They couldn't believe that. Not in that war, not in the wars that we have fought since then. You have to think that it means something. You have to think that your friend who died next to you, probably saving your life, that his death meant something. And so I bit my tongue. I covered the stories. And as it happens, I moved on from the Marines who walked everywhere. I wore out 2 pair of boots just marching around with the Marines in these mud pit rice paddies, and they didn't have any helicopters to speak of, so it was all walking, and it was all down on the coast where it was really hot. And then I heard about this experimental division that was arriving in the nice, cool, high mountains of the Central Highlands, and they had 435 helicopters on their inventory, and I said, aha, I will ride to work from now on. Well, that left out the part where you get off that helicopter and people start shooting at you. But I did. I moved up to the Central Highlands and immediately got in trouble in October of '65. I heard that the Play Me Special Forces camp had been surrounded by a regiment of North Vietnamese. And I was stomping up and down the flight line. I know I had that. There it is. Stomping up and down the flight line, cussing because I couldn't find a ride to take me to that camp. And I ran into an old Texas Aggie helicopter pilot. And I'd played poker and drank their whiskey, and we talked the same language. And he said, "What's the matter, Joe?" And I said, "Well, I'm trying to get to Play Me Special Forces camp, and I can't get a ride." And he said, "Well, duh." He said, "The airspace is closed around that camp. They've shot down 2 helicopters, a B-57 Canberra bomber and an A-1E Sky Raider. They're not letting anybody fly in there. I said, I know that, but I still want to go. And he scratched his head, and like a good Texas Aggie, he said, well, I wouldn't mind taking a look at the place. I'll give you a ride out there. So I got a picture I took. That chopper is laying on its side, about to spiral down as best they can with a Huey. And the camp fills the door of that Huey, that triangular camp, and there are a lot of puffs of white smoke where the mortar rounds are landing all over the camp. And that's where we're going. Well, I bail off that helicopter, and they throw a few wounded on, and my buddy is over the fence and headed over the mountain and giving me a rude gesture through the plexiglass. And I'm standing there, and a master sergeant, special forces guy, comes running up. He said, sir, I don't know who you are, but Major Beckwith wants to talk to you right away. I said, well, which one is he? He said, it's that big fellow over there jumping up and down on his hat. Not a good sign, Joe. So I went up to Major Beckwith, and he said, I'm going to leave a lot of words out of what he said. He said, who the hell are you? And I said, oh, I'm a reporter. And he said a whole lot more of those words. And then he said, you know, he said, I need everything in the damn world. He said, I need medevac, I need food, I need ammo. I would love a box of cigars and a bottle of Jim Beam, and what has the Army in its wisdom sent me but a godforsaken reporter? And this is not going well, I can see that. And he says, I have news for you, son. I have no vacancy here for a reporter, but I desperately need a corner machine gunner, and you're it. Well, my ride's going over the mountain, so I had about 10 minutes of his instruction. And I must say that Major Beckwith later became Colonel Beckwith and formed the Delta Force. So we're talking a bear of a man with the bark on him. And he gives me 10 minutes instruction on the .30 caliber air-cooled light machine gun. He shows me how to load it and how to clear a jam, and he says, here are your instructions. You can shoot the little brown men outside the barbed wire. Don't shoot the ones inside. They belong to me. He said one more thing. He said, you see that bunker down there on the other point? He said, that's a machine gun bunker with CIDG, South Vietnamese forces in it, and I don't trust them as far as I can throw them. So I want you to always keep one eye on them, and if they turn that machine gun around, take them out. Yes, sir. 2 days and 2 nights later, we were eventually relieved by an armor column that came in and a battalion of 1st Cavalry troops. And I went to say my goodbyes to Major Beckwith. He said, you done pretty good on the gun, son. He said, would you like to make one of our little operations with my B-52 detachment? I said, where are you going? He said, over the fence, Laos. I said, how long would we be gone? He said, oh, a couple of weeks. I said, you know, I'm probably going to get fired for not getting in touch with my boss for 2 days and 2 nights. No way I can do that. He said, okay. He said, you're not carrying a piece. I said, technically speaking, in spite of the use you have made of me these last 2 days and nights, I'm a civilian non-combatant. And he looked at me and he grinned and he said, ain't no such thing in these mountains, sonny. He said, "Sergeant Major, get the man an M16 and a bag full of magazines. He's going to need them." And I did. And so I will tell you, if you've seen the movie, Hollywood has the Sergeant Major give me an M16, and I'm here to tell you he didn't have to. I brought my own. But I would need that gun. I would need all the luck in the world, because 3 weeks later, one day past my 24th birthday, happy birthday, Joe, I got on a helicopter and flew into the pages of history, into a battle that was developing between 400 badly outnumbered cavalry guys from the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, and over 2,000 very good North Vietnamese infantry. And when I say very good, I mean exactly that. Any time that I heard some general saying that the enemy in Vietnam were cowards because they wouldn't come out and stand up and fight like a real army, I thought, what a fool. What a fool. These were good guys, and if you thought that they were cowards, you'd probably be pushing up daisies before the operation was over. They were good. They were good. And another thing, you know, when we went back to Vietnam in, Lord, I want to say 1993, and went back to the old battlefields in company with the commanders of the other side who had done their best to kill us. We spent 5 or 6 days on this little bus bouncing around Vietnam, and we learned something. We learned that we had more in common with them than we have with your average American civilian. In a funny way of speaking, we were blood brothers. And, you know, Hal Moore sat there with Lieutenant General Wen Hu An, who had been his opposite number on the battlefield. And they went over their careers, and it was stair-step. It was a carbon copy. Hal Moore had gotten his wings in Korea as a company commander on places like Old Baldy and Pork Chop Hill. And General An, as a captain, had fought at Dien Bien Phu against the French, and in fact captured the bunker of the French general. These guys, they talked the same language. After a few days on that bus, a big, tall Vietnamese colonel came up to me and he punched me in the chest, and through the translator, he said, "You have the heart of a soldier. It's the same heart that beats in my chest. I'm glad I didn't kill you." And I looked him in the eye and I said, "Well, I'm glad I didn't kill you either, Colonel. If you'd have stuck your head up, I'd have got you." But that's, 20, 25 years down the road can make a world of difference. I left that battlefield with a changed heart. I knew that 80 young Americans, most of them younger than me, had died so that I might live. Another 130 had been terribly wounded, this out of 400 men. Our sister battalion would be ambushed the next day and lose 155 men killed in 6 hours' time and another 130 or 40 wounded. They went home from that operation in 3 deuce and a half, so it was all that was left of their battalion. I look, I've gone to a lot of wars since then. Never saw anything like that battle. Never wanted to. In fact, riding with the 24th Infantry across the Iraq Western Desert in the Gulf War, all the way across there, I kept saying this little prayer: Lord, don't let them be anywhere near as good as the North Vietnamese. These boys don't need to see that, and I've already seen it. But I left there knowing that I owed a great debt of gratitude to those who didn't come out alive and to those who came out horribly wounded and damaged. And I must say that of those who survived, not one of us left that place the same man who arrived there. We were all changed. You cannot, and I must say also, I really was a civilian and a non-combatant, even though I carried that M16 and used it on occasion. All that said, what I knew and what I learned in that place is how marvelously we are served as a people by those who wear the uniform and are willing to lay their lives on the line for our freedom, for our democracy. Ronnie Reagan said Vietnam was a noble war. He's wrong. There are no noble wars. But noble men and now young women fight those wars, and the nobility rests with them. They are willing to lay their lives down for the man on the right, the man on the left, the man behind them. And in this world today, that is a remarkable, remarkable trait. And I can't say enough good about them. And I know there are, they call themselves revisionist historians who write books now with titles like Kill Everything That Moves. And they would have you believe that we were all murderers, baby killers, village burners. And I did 4 tours in Vietnam from the beginning of that war to the end of it. And I spent all my time at the point of the spear. And I never once saw a war crime. I never once saw that. I saw collateral damage all the time. If you're using air power and you're using artillery, the innocent are going to be hurt. But that's an accident of war. It's not a deliberate crime. Our soldiers, our Marines, don't do war crimes. The few that do are caught and punished severely for it, as they should be. But the vast majority, many of them in Vietnam, 60% of Colonel Moore's battalion were draftees, men who had been drafted in late 1963, early 64. Many of them had less than 2 weeks left on their term of service and should have been on a plane going home when they were fighting for their lives and the lives of their friends in this battle. Men went home in shiny aluminum army coffins when they had 10 days left to serve. Breaks your heart, breaks your heart. I was so proud to stand alongside them in battle. I'm just as proud to stand alongside them today while they fight a different kind of battle, trying to get the medical care they need that was promised to them, and the VA has a real hard time at times delivering. I have kept always somebody on a short string in the VA secretary's office, and I can call and get a little bit of heat put when somebody is being screwed, when somebody who was shot to doll ribbons goes there and spends a year and a half in an Army hospital and is put out on the street with a leg frozen in a bent position with a 30% disability, a couple of $100 a month to take care of a wife and 5 kids. You know, there are things that just drive me crazy, and boy, that is one of them. I'm going to raise hell 6 foot and put a chalk under it. And I do. And I am only sorry, as are my friends in the VA, that sometimes it takes that to get them to do what they should have done automatically. That's the part that kills me. We have a sacred obligation to take care of those that we send off to war who come back hurt, broken, damaged in whatever way. They went, they served honorably, and we just can't do what we have done at the end of every war in the history of our country, which is turn our backs on our veterans. And we do it almost automatically. The Agent Orange veterans had to fight for 25 years before the VA would admit there was such a thing and that maybe it was doing a great deal of harm. The Gulf War veterans, many of whom rode through areas where we had blown up dumps of poison gas shells that were stockpiled there, and they breathed that stuff, and they were damaged. Now out of the Gulf War, there are people whose bunks were downwind of these burn pits where they were burning all kinds of chemicals, and they're damaged too. And they'll have to fight for 25 years to get anybody to pay any attention to it. And eventually we'll get around to it, but if we stall long enough, most of them will die. I almost think that's what their plan is. If you stall long enough, they'll go away, they'll die, and we can't do that. We cannot do that. It's wrong. It's so wrong. So I tell you what, I'd rather listen to your questions than listen to my tongue rattle. So we're gonna slide this over to Q&A, and if you got the cojones to ask, I got the cojones to answer.
Questions, please. I know we got some questions. Yes.
There we go.
I've seen the movie about 15 times. How far physically is it from where Greg Kinnear is flying to safety and coming back and forth?
Depends. It's about 15, 16 miles to Play Me Camp, which was kind of a forward base. But if he needed to refuel, and they did about every second trip, he had to fly to Pleiku, to Camp Holloway to refuel, and that would have been more like 30 miles. So it was a pretty fair round trip.
You're spending time in northern I Corps above Dubai or?
Oh yeah, I did. I covered the Marines for 7 months, and wherever they went, I went. And I saw some of that country on that first tour, saw some of it on my second tour. Saw a lot of it on my second tour because my second tour was 1971 when I came back to cover Lam Son 719, the invasion of Laos. And we had a dedicated Huey from the Secretary of Defense for the press, and we'd flip a coin every night to see which lucky five got to get on that helicopter the next day and fly up to the Techipon area along the Ho Chi Minh Trail and sit down on a bare hill and watch the ARVN, who we had persuaded that they were big and bad and rough and that they could go in and block the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And we sent 40,000 of them across that border to be greeted by 60,000 North Vietnamese regulars. And they got their ass handed to them. So that was when I knew for sure that war was being lost. There was no way in hell. We would sit down on that bare hill, and as far as you could see, there were interlocking bomb craters from the B-52 strikes. And the North Vietnamese had pipelines with fuel running through the middle of that, and roads for tanks. And it just seemed to me that Vietnamization was not going to work. It was just a very thin fig leaf to cover our withdrawal. And eventually that's what it turned out, and it turned out very badly for the Vietnamese.
Were you up around Hue during the Tet Offensive at all?
I was not in country in '68. I left after a year and a half in late '66. And I told my boss, I never want to go back there again. I've seen it all. And I made that stick for a while. And then in '71, after 5 of my friends went down in a helicopter and were killed, he called up and he said, I'm calling in all my cards. You got to go back. And my wife was crying, and she said, if you go, I may not be here when you come back. And I said, if I go, I may not come back. I at that point thought we were all meant to die there, and damn near did. But yes, I was up way and beyond in '71. Yes, ma'am.
Tell me about your camera that you carried and how you filed stories from the field.
Nothing like today, let me assure you. I carried 2 Nikon F black body 35 millimeter film cameras, about 4 lenses, a brick or 2, 50 rolls of Tri-X film, black and white, and half that number of rolls of Kodachrome color slide film, and the M16 and 20 loaded magazines and 4 canteens. And you know, when they started work on the movie, the kid who was going to play me, Barry Pepper, sat down and he said, what'd you carry in your pack? And I started telling him. He started writing it on a napkin. We were sitting in a chili joint in Columbus, Georgia. And I said, what do you want to know all that for? He said, oh, he says, I'm going to go out and buy that and put it in my pack. And I said, Barry, nobody'll know it's there. And he said, wrong, I'll know it's there. The kid was serious. He really was. He wanted to know if I wore dog tags and what blood type. I said, what are you going to do? He said, oh, I'm going to have a set of tags made with all that on it. I said, you better hope you don't get hurt out there unless you got O negative blood.
How do you feel like he did on your character?
He did a great job. He's a really fine young actor, and he's going to be with us for a good while. He won an Emmy for his portrayal of Bobby Kennedy in the HBO movie. And it's interesting, when they sent him the telegram telling him to come down for the ceremony and get his statue, he sent him a telegram back and said that he was going elk hunting in the Rockies and he wasn't available. Good guy, good guy. The best guy in the movie, though, was Sam Elliott, playing the sergeant major. Wonderful man, wonderful actor.
Too.
Huh?
That was accurate too.
Fairly so. Actually, the sergeant major was a little meaner than Sam portrayed him.
Joe, you and I have met, and you know that I was in the Ia Drang also. I was a medic attached to a recon group, and we left Play Me looking for that group that you finally fell into or got into. My squad leader was a young man named Robert Wilson, who was an E5 buck sergeant, and he took a round in his right hip, and I remember patching him up and putting him on a medevac. He later, through the years, became the command division sergeant major.
Oh, but let's do this story right. He was laid up in an Army hospital, and he got to thinking, and what he thought was he didn't see anything any officer did that he couldn't do better. And so he went to OCS when he got out of the hospital, and he came back to Vietnam as a captain commanding a company. And then the war ended, and he was offered a choice. Since he didn't have a college degree, they told him that either he could get out of the Army or he could take a reduction in rank to master sergeant. And he took the reduction, and going into the Gulf War, he was the command sergeant major of the 1st Cavalry Division. And before combat started, General Fred Franks reached down and grabbed Bob Wilson and made him the command sergeant major of the 7th Army. And but I got to tell you one more Bob Wilson story while we're at it. I did a cover piece for U.S. News on the 25th anniversary of the Ia Drang battles. And the boss said, okay, for a follow-up, why don't you go over to Saudi Arabia and see what the old 1st to the 7th Cav is now like? And so I said, okay. And I headed off to Saudi Arabia, and I passed word to the 1st Cavalry Division that I was there and what I was there to do. And I got back nothing but silence. Seems the commanding general, General Tillelly, had decided that the Army historians could write the story of the 1st Cavalry Division in this war, and he didn't want any goddamn reporters around. So I chewed on that a little bit, and I remembered Bob Wilson was the command sergeant major, and I passed the word down to him. And he came the next day in a Humvee and picked me up at the hotel and took me out and dumped me with the 7th Cavalry, who were just leaving on a week's exercise in the desert. All this is in, I want to say it's in November, late November, before the war started. And I had a great time with the 7th Cav rolling around the desert. Then came time to leave, and Wilson said, I'm going to pick you up, but I want to take you to breakfast at the general's mess. And he did. And the general and the chief of staff sat there glowering at us while we ate their bacon and eggs. And it just goes to show you who really runs a division in our Army. It's the command sergeant major, not the damn general.
Well, it'll be 50 years exactly tomorrow when he took that round in his hip. And I was wondering if you had the good fortune to run into him at one time or another.
From time to time.
Outstanding.
With all of your experience in combat throughout the years, what are some of the characteristics, regardless of the war, that makes for a very good Marine or a very good soldier?
Yeah, often I get asked to compare the soldiers that I marched with in Vietnam with the soldiers I marched with in Iraq or in the Gulf War. And look, the young ones today are better educated, they're smarter, they're better equipped, their weaponry is better, the high-tech stuff, all of that. But there's one thing that never changes, and that is the heart of a soldier. That is something very special, and it never changes. It hadn't changed in 2,000 years of recorded history. The common soldier is an uncommon individual. He is willing to risk all to protect the advances of his society, his clan, his people, whatever, through history. It's a very selfless sacrifice on the part of these young men and now young women, that they will do this to protect everyone else. And today, less than 1% of our population wear the uniform, do all the sacrificing. They and their families do all the suffering for all the rest of us. And I know from my reading of history that our founding fathers never intended it to be so. Their intention was that every able-bodied man in the country, every citizen, would owe an obligation of service in time of distress, emergency, war, whatever. And it's not how it works now. And I know that the commanders and the politicians don't want to hear it, but my idea has been steady for 25 years. We should have and demand true national service in this country. And, every able-bodied, sound mind, you hit 18, you owe your country 2 years. And I'll give you a choice, 5 different things. The Peace Corps, the Job Corps. Let's reestablish the old Civilian Conservation Corps and rebuild our national parks. An education corps to work in the ghetto schools, a hospital corps to work in the mental institutions. And if you do your 2 years, you get a 2-year free ride at any college that'll have you in the country. And if you want to serve in the military, it's a 4-year commitment with a 4-year free ride in college. And I know it would be difficult and it would be costly, but I think it would lead to a renaissance in our country and among our youth. It really would. And you know, I couldn't find a congressman who'll put that bill in the hopper, and I've been looking for 30 years. I'm deaf as a post. You have to.
Flight or our wounded warriors, what idea do you have of the level of care and benefits which these moderately and severely wounded warriors come back? What would be appropriate for them to get? Where benefits, care?
Now that's a tough question with a simple answer. Everything. They get everything they need. Not only that, there should be support provided if they're being taken care of by their mother and father or a wife and kids. There should be support there as well. They've given everything. You know, I look at some of the casualties coming back today. Those men would have died in the Vietnam War because the technological advances are so great that now you can have quadruple amputees coming back, and their lives have been saved. And I wonder sometimes if they had a vote, if they would want to live at that level of disability. But that decision is taken from them. And when they come home, we owe them everything for as long as they live. And, you know, if you don't want to pay that, then don't have wars. Every time I see a senator get up and say, oh, we ought to send troops into Syria, we ought to send troops into Libya, we ought to send troops everywhere, I look at them and say, your son and daughter first, your grandchildren first, and you go with them. Yeah. Let you lead the way. You be point, and let us know how that works out.
Did you know or know of journalists who were killed in Vietnam?
More than 70 journalists died seeking the truth, seeking the stories. Many of them my colleagues and friends. That it is the price that we are willing to pay to do our jobs. And we should never go to war without the war correspondents, because the day that happens, you no longer have the truth. It'll be spun so tightly and so fast that you'll never know what really happened. So you're gonna go, take your American Express card and take a reporter too.
What would you say your lessons of Vietnam were? What did we learn that we should move forward with?
Were you there?
Yes.
Then you learned some lessons, and I learned some lessons, and everybody in this room who was there learned some lessons, and the politicians didn't learn a goddamn thing. What I learned is, first off, don't go to war with somebody who you don't understand. When you don't know a thing about their culture, their religion, their history, then you shouldn't be going to war against them. We have a certain historical weakness when it comes to picking out somebody to go fight. We picked out the Vietnamese. Now, among the other things that we didn't know about them is that they had been fighting the Chinese for 2,000 years. Our first trip to Hanoi, we met with General Giap, the head man. And he said, you're going to be sitting around drinking a lot of tea waiting on your appointments. He said, you should go over to the Natural History Museum here in Hanoi and take a look. Never mind the exhibits, it's all bullshit. He said, take a look at the timeline of Vietnam's history. And there it was. I mean, we hot-footed over there. And it's about 70 yards long on a blank wall, and it's a map and a timeline joined. And I gotta wave my hands around, so I'll set that down. So here are the salient things. There are 6 invasions of Vietnam by China. They last, some of them only for 100 years or 200 years. The longest lasted 600 years. But these red arrows would come down and then they would be driven out. They would be driven out at great sacrifice of life. You know, the things were bloody back then, even when they were using swords and bows and arrows. And here's Vietnam, a small country, fighting the greatest country in the world at that time, China. And so 6 times they came, 6 times they were driven out. These are people with a bark on them, and this is who we decide to get in the middle of their civil war. Not smart. Even my mama would say, that's not smart, Joe. And she'd be right. And then, God help us, we decide to invade Afghanistan. Those people been fighting for 2,000 years. And if they don't have a foreigner to fight, they were perfectly happy to fight the next village over the valley from them. And if they can't find somebody over there to fight, they'll fight someone in their own village or in their own family. They like that stuff. They are 14th century tribal groups, and they love nothing better than to cut the head off a sheep and use it to play polo with. Now, again, they were invaded by Alexander the Great, and it cost him his life. They were invaded by Queen Victoria, sent 3 British armies separately into Afghanistan, and one of them, she only got 1 lady back out of 20,000 men. And then the Russians decided to invade them. And they have no rules of engagement whatsoever. They went at the Afghanis with everything they had, including, and this I particularly disgusting, they would drop small mines that were built like toys, like butterflies and things like that, that kids would pick up and it would blow their hand off. And then mom and dad would have to take them and go refugee to Pakistan to try to get some medical help. Now, when you're willing to be that brutal, and still they did no good, they ended up walking back across that bridge to Russia with their tail between their legs. We just can't afford to do that. We can't afford to be that stupid. We've got to read history. We have to elect smart politicians who have some courage some ethics, some morals, and some character, but especially smart. Now, if we can just find one. They're hiding. You know, when I was a kid growing up, 19-year-old reporter in Kansas City, Missouri, my mentor was a guy named Harry Truman. I met him on the phone, and he said, "Come on over to the office sometime, son." And I would go over there at every opportunity and sit and just listen to him. Later, I was sent to Topeka, Kansas as a State House correspondent, and I had lunch once a week with a guy named Alf Landon, moderate Republican, had been governor of Kansas, ran against Roosevelt in '36, and until George McGovern came along, was the worst defeated candidate in history in our country. But those guys I listened to, I learned from, and they were both moderates. And moderates are what are missing from our political landscape now. I don't know whether they went off to the elephant boneyard or they were driven out or gone into exile in Haiti or what, but there are no moderates left in our political landscape, and I miss them. We miss them, and we need them. We need guys like Truman and Landon, Sam Rayburn, who could fight all day on the floor of the House and then sit down and play poker and drink whiskey at night and sort out the business of the next day. And we don't have that now. Now it's all blood sport.
When you were in Vietnam, did you have any relationship or experience with the Montagnard people?
Absolutely. Found them to be the most decent people in the whole damn country. They were betrayed at every hand by everybody in the war, including us. But remarkable people, honorable people. Hated the Vietnamese and vice versa.
Fort Benning, I think, is hosting the 50th anniversary of the battle. Can you tell us a little bit about what's taking place there?
Well, it's a 50th anniversary, kind of an OPD, Officer Professional Development thing. There's a panel of veterans of the first battle at Landing Zone X-Ray, and in the afternoon, this is on 24 November, in the afternoon, there's a panel of from the 2nd of the 7th Battalion, Landing Zone Albany. And then that evening, there'll be a dinner at the National Infantry Museum, and I'll speak. Plus, we're having a 50th anniversary Ia Drang dinner on the anniversary of the beginning of the Landing Zone X-Ray battle, 14 November in Washington, D.C. So we're marking it slowly. We're all still, you know, in 1965, when that battle was fought, we were only 20 years away from the end of World War II, and only 11 years away from the end of the Korean fighting. And now we're 50 years along. I find that very hard to believe.
Joe, I noticed, and I think I read it in the second book, that General Moore, a West Pointer, if I'm not mistaken, was asked to speak at West Point at graduation ceremony, and he was asked about our responsibility in Iraq, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, that he said to the classmates that not one American life would be worth getting involved in Iraq. That was a heck of a statement to say at West Point.
He made that speech in 2005.
Okay. I was just wondering if you could elaborate on that, or if
He said some remarkable things in that speech. It was, you know, the graduating class, a lot of other West Pointers, and as is normal with those things, all of the colonels, the professors, were lined up on the front row. And I don't know what they thought they were going to hear, but here's what Hal Moore told them in his talk. He said that the greatest component of leadership is love. To be a good commander, you must love your soldiers. To be a good commander, you must love your job. But most of all, you must love and care for your troops. And then he was, in the question period, he was asked what he thought about the Iraq War. And he said, what's going on in Iraq is not worth one single American life. Not one. We have no business being there. And we spent the lives of 5,000 young men and young women. For what? Another one of those places absolutely full of murderous bastards who just delighted in killing us. And again, on the eve of that invasion, General Eric Shinseki, the Chief of Staff of the Army, was up testifying before a Senate Armed Services Committee hearing. And he didn't want to answer this, but he was pinned against the wall by a senator who was very aggressive and who demanded to know the general's estimate of how many troops it would take, not just to seize Iraq, but to pacify it. And he estimated 300 to 500,000 soldiers would be needed. And the next day, that raging asshole Paul Wolfowitz went before that same committee and said that the general didn't know what he was talking about, that there was no tribal rivalries, no ethnic problems, no religious divisions in Iraq, such as we had in Afghanistan, and it would be a cakewalk. And they proceeded, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, proceeded to make General Shinseki's life miserable. He still had 18 months to serve as the Chief of Staff, and he was made to be a pariah for telling the truth.
I have two things. That brings me to one, which is our military today has no strong speakers. If you look at Russian revolutions, that took the military in Russia standing up and taking over and taking down the government, which was corrupt. Today, our military is being overrun by a government which will not allow the military to speak the truth about what is happening in the world. I'll leave that aside because that is a big subject. But I want to get back to what you said, which I feel is so important. 1% of the people in this country are involved in serving in the military. That has never worked in any country in the world ever. And that's when I said amen. And that is a serious situation, and you gave many opportunities, Peace Corps, many others, for people to serve. This country cannot continue with the youth being so disengaged with loving, you talked about love, with loving their country. So, there is a important issue. The youth have to be engaged with loving their country, and when education is not teaching them to love their country, we have a problem.
Well, I can't argue with you on any of that. We have a problem. We have to address it. We sit at the crossroads of history, and nothing is happening. We have gridlock in Congress, deliberate gridlock. If someone came up with the greatest idea for this country's future, he would not be allowed to say what it was. He wouldn't have a chance in hell to get it past Congress and into law. I don't know where we go, but I know we've got to do something. And there it is. Last question, way in the back.
I work at Clemson University, and one of the things that I do is I have a veteran support writing group that meets once a week, and I'm trying to encourage veterans, both young and old, to express themselves through writing, tell their stories, because it's my experience that many veterans, upon returning from overseas, sort of close themselves off. They isolate themselves, and I think that that's one of the reasons why 22 veterans are committing suicide each and every day. So I believe that by expressing themselves partly through writing, we can alleviate a lot of that pressure that veterans are putting on themselves. So my question to you is, as a man who distinguished himself with a career in writing, who wrote in the war and wrote about the war, what's something you would say to a new writer, veteran writer specifically, to sort of encourage them to keep up with that?
Just do it. Go ahead and write. Express yourself. Get it down on paper. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it as a profession. There's not a lot of money in it. But there is what you seek, a measure of peace to telling your story, to writing it, to getting it down. Now I'm going to also tell you that when we finished that book after 10 years of research and 6 months of writing, the general and I thought, wow, maybe this will close the loop. Maybe this will make all of it easier for us, that the nightmares will go away. And what we found out is that's not true. Those things do not go away, not even after 50 years. The memories are there. And what we finally came to figure out is that this is what our duty is to carry the memory of those who died for us. They don't weigh much. You can get a lot of them in your backpack, and you can carry them with you. Thank you. Thank you all.